Welcome back, everyone, to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show, the home of Googleization Nation, where we talk with HR and business thought leaders about the crazy, never normal shift going on all around us. Our goal is to bring you ways to reimagine tomorrow and explore the ever-changing convergence of people, business, and technology. Here is your host, Ira Wolfe.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization Show and another edition of our new monthly series at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street, where we'll be talking each month about the intersection of the economy, politics, and technology. We realize you have a lot of listening and watching options and are grateful you've taken the time to join us today. Joining me once again at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street will be two familiar guests, Matt Van Alstyne and John Aiden Byrne. In addition, we have a special guest on each month, and this month we're thrilled to welcome back Gad Lebanon. He's a friend of the show and chief economist at Burning Glass Institute. You'll hear more from and about Gad in just a few minutes. On today's show, we're going to try and tackle more top of mind and vexing challenges facing business owners, executives, investors, government officials, and nearly everyone living on Main Street. As we discussed last month with Jeff Webb, the middle class is now front and center in the upcoming U.S. elections. Well, right after the show, Gad released his newsletter, which included a brilliant piece of research that showed how the Midwest, the poster child of the middle class, is contending with simultaneous declines in educational attainment, population, and economic development, and how it has been influencing voter preferences. Let me just offer you three disturbing trends he highlighted. Nearly every state in the Midwest now falls below the average state income when compared with the rest of the country. And only 3 of 72 metropolitan areas identified as top performers in personal income and per capita income growth were in the Midwest. And finally, in addition to declining per capita income, Midwestern states have also been among the slowest growing in terms of population. That's just the tip of the iceberg. And we're really excited to have Gad here today to shed more light on the middle class, its implications for the election, and our economy. But that's not all. Gad's going to help us explore the likelihood of a recession, what's happening with labor markets and immigration, and wherever else this conversation leads, as usually we get into some rabbit holes. So grab your coffee, tea, or maybe your favorite stiff drink and get comfy. You're not going to want to miss this. I'm pleased to welcome back Matt and John. Matt Van Alstyne is co-founder and managing partner of Odeon Capital Group. It's a leading full-service boutique broker dealer to institutional clients. Many of you know Matt from his commentary and outlook on the highly rated Odeon Capital Conversations podcast. John Aiden Byrne is a veteran Wall Street business journalist, editor, filmmaker, and successful podcast host of Odeon Capital Conversations and Dig Life Deep. John's newest ventures are 2 movie projects, one on the legendary life of a Wall Street CEO and scholar, and the other on Norman Rockwell. And as I mentioned, our special guest this month is Gad Lebanon. He's chief economist of the Burning Glass Institute. Previously, Gad was with the conference board, where he was founder of the Labor Market Institute. His research focuses on trends in the U.S. and global labor markets, the U.S. economy, and their impact on employers. He's a regular contributor to Forbes and also often contributes opinion pieces to other national media outlets. So let's welcome back John and Matt and Gad. Welcome, gentlemen.
Yep, great to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you, Ira.
So we've got a ton to talk about. I think last time Matt, well, not Matt, but Matt and John, and just give some reference to Gad, we were in the midst of the Republican National Convention. And I think one of the topics was what was going to happen with President Biden. Was he going to drop out or not? And It seems like an eternity ago. It seems like we've lived 12 months in the last 4 weeks. Things are moving on, and here we are sitting right in the midst. We're broadcasting again right in the midst of the Democratic National Conference. So there's a ton of things going on. But with that, our conversation last month, as I mentioned in the preview, was about the middle class. We had a great conversation with Jeff Webb, how we called it Middle Class Mayhem, but how the middle class has been being crushed for about 30 years, or for the last 30 or 40 years, especially with manufacturing decline and technology. And then I think it had to be just days later, Gad, you released your newsletter, and it basically took it to a new level. So I want to start there today. I want to continue that conversation and start with the middle class. And you can give some background on this. And while you're doing that, I'm gonna post one of the slides that you had, or one of the graphs that you had positioned in the newsletter for everyone to kind of see. But give us a little bit of background on why you found that important and what some of your key findings were.
Sure. So I think it's no secret that things didn't go well for the Midwest in recent decades. Um, Manufacturing was important for the Midwest more than in any other area, and manufacturing disappeared for in many locations. What is less well known is that one of the other reasons why the Midwest is struggling is because the tech revolution, or the tech is the fastest growing sector in the US and in the world, but it mostly skipped the Midwest. There aren't a lot of, compared to other parts of the country, there isn't a lot going on in Midwest tech. So in terms of the economy, the Midwest is struggling. That is driving away a lot of people. Population growth in the Midwest is either low or negative, and but that story doesn't end there. This deterioration is leading to a political shift in the Midwest, which I think also a lot of people know. In 2012, it was mostly Democratic, and then in 2016 it shifted. 2020 it went back. 2024 we don't know yet, but that's a big question for this election. But it definitely, more than any other region in the country, the Midwest shifted towards the Republican in the last decade. Um, and that has implications also in terms of attitudes towards higher education. We know that among Republicans there has been a very fast growing skepticism um, about higher education and declining in enrollment. And whereas the rest of the country in the last decade or two, there's been continuing growth in education attainment, in the Midwest, there was stagnation. So that kind of leads to a potential vicious cycle. There is a deterioration, and then fewer people go to college, and that causes further falling behind. And I don't know where it ends, but I think the Midwest is in the middle of a deterioration and a vicious cycle. And we see in this chart that this is the income per person in certain several Midwestern states relative to the rest of the country. And we see that in the 50s, all of those Midwestern states were above the country average, and now 4 out of the 5 are below, and Illinois, which is still above, is growing, is reaching the average of the country soon, I think. So yeah, that I think that has important economic implications, but also political implications. I think the next elections will very much depend on what happens in the 3 swing states in the Midwest, which are Wisconsin and Michigan. And Pennsylvania is not the Midwest, but some people will argue that the western part of Pennsylvania is the Midwest. So those 3 states will determine what happens in this election.
Yeah, that's James Carville's famous line when he was running the Clinton campaign, or the Clinton campaigns back in the 90s. Pennsylvania is actually three different regions. It's Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and Ohio.
Mm.
Yeah.
Shouldn't have laughed at that. Sorry.
It's being in Pennsylvania all my life. It's pretty true.
Yeah.
So, Gad, this obviously this leads into not only in the directions, and we can't predict where it's going to go in November and beyond, but certainly the trend has certainly been a downward shift. Is it now there? Through and again, some of it's hype, but is it Iowa or Illinois that's got the new battery plant that's being opened? I mean, there are some technology facilities that are finally some of the chip money is finally getting out there. It may just be too early to see if that trend is going to shift.
No, I believe it will help kind of some of the kind of federal policy to support some locations in the Midwest and the Northeast that are struggling. I doubt that it's in a magnitude that can be a turning point. It's probably not. And there are some bright spot in the Midwest. It's not all bleak. Like Columbus, Ohio, for example, is doing well. There is I think this Goshen, this metro area that is the RV capital of the world. But there are few and far between to, I think, really change the negative trajectory.
Do you see anything, and that just brought up a point, and this maybe will lead into our conversation about the where inflation's headed and the prospect for a recession, and it looks like we're going to have an interest rate reduction in the coming weeks. So again, as I've defined the era at the time we're living in as never normal, but we tend to try to homogenize the United States, sometimes for good, that we're not red and blue, but we're the United States of America. But when it comes to the economy, there's certainly areas that are prospering, which came up, certainly highlighted even by this graphic, where the highest levels of GDP were versus the lowest levels, and the Midwest, unfortunately, many of the states were in the lower part of the chart. When we look at where the country is headed as far as a recession, what are your insights on that? And I guess, are we going to have this soft landing, or there's people talking about a recession, and then even maybe a depression, by 2030.
So I think a lot of the recession fear was a result of the last month's jobs report and the decline in stock prices back then. I think they were overblown, the fears. If you look at actual economic activity, there isn't like in terms of consumer spending or business spending or government spending, there isn't that much to be worried about yet. There may be some slowdown, but I think a recession is very premature to be afraid of. That's my opinion. I think also another positive thing is what the latest trends in productivity growth. So in the last 4 or 5 quarters, labor productivity has been growing by almost 3%, which is well above what we've seen in the decade previously before the pandemic. So that, I think, is a very recent development and a positive one. I think a lot of it is because of massive investment during the pandemic in First, it was in things related to remote work and remote everything. Now, potentially because of generative AI, but there was a huge investment and spending on R&D that are boosting productivity. Whether it will be a long-term thing is still the jury is out on that. A lot of that will have to do with how real is the generative AI hype? Is it just hype or mostly hype, or there is some truth to it? I tend to be, I think, cautiously on the optimistic side of that. Um, but that's definitely been an under discussed topic, and I can tell you that my next one of my next newsletters is going to be about that topic.
Well, that's good news on the productivity because we saw that kind of 30, 40-year decline where productivity is. We've talked about that. But John and Matt have been eerily quiet so far. So unusual. So John or Matt, do you want to jump in?
Well, I'm just curious. These are really interesting data points, Gad. What impact will the decline in the excess pandemic era savings have as we go forward? In August 2021, those savings had reached 2.1 trillion, and that was spent out in subsequent years. During COVID, obviously, nobody was spending. They were at home. They were getting stimulus checks. Restaurants were closed. Public venues were closed. And then, all this excess government spending, which contributed to inflation. So that's gone. And we also have rising credit card default rates, credit card debt in excess of 1 trillion. Balance are starting to reach new records again. And then we saw the recent jobs report and other skittish indicators. How will that impact the scenarios that you're laying out?
Well, so that has been going on, like the depletion of savings. That's been going on for a while, but still consumer spending has been strong. And the latest retail sales report was also pretty strong. So at the moment, there isn't yet evidence of the consumer taking a step back. And based on history, consumer spending is relatively stable. Like you need to something really strong to knock it off its course. And I just don't see a negative shock that is happened so far. In the past, it was things like a burst of a bubble or a strong hike in interest rates that led to a housing crash or things like that. Now, especially given that the Fed is likely to cut rates in the coming months, I just don't see what this shock is that is going to push the US economy into a recession. Recessions don't usually happen out of the blue. There is a clear reason why they happen. There may be a slowdown. Slowdowns do happen more frequently, but so I wouldn't be surprised if we see a slowdown in the US economy, but a recession would require a shock that I haven't seen yet. Whether there will be one is, of course, it wouldn't be a shock if we can anticipate it.
Well, I would point out that in 2007, the yield curve inverted, and then we had, the Fed cutting interest rates in September of 2008 before we were shocked into a recession. In 2019, the yield curve inverted for a split second in September of 2019, and then we had a flash crash. I know it was COVID related, but it was a shock that came out of nowhere in 2020 that caused at least a 2-week recession or maybe 2-month recession. So I feel like recessions tend to come not if you see it coming, you prepare for it. It's the stuff that you don't see coming that that shocks the economic Fed into a recession, it seems to me. But I have a question on your research. Do you think that the Midwest decline could you point to reasons being local governments, local policies, local trends, or is this more of the continuation basically since the 1770s of slowly federalizing everything, and everything just gets sucked out of the Midwest? And and it's not so much that the Midwest is not competitive and they don't produce smart people. It's the people that are produced out of there that do go to college, then move away because the economic policies of the federal government create the attraction to move away. And and you look at some states, in Iowa, I sit and think, oh, they have some pretty good policies, but you look at Illinois and you're like, well, of course they're going to go down the toilet. They're a terribly managed state. What do you think on that?
So I'm not an expert on local governments and state governments, so I don't know if like the governments in the Midwest are worse than in other places. But I think that the Midwest part of it is kind of manufacturing was more concentrated in the Midwest than any other region. And so the decline in manufacturing hurt the Midwest more than any other region. That's kind of bad luck. I don't think when manufacturing was, it was just created in the Midwest more than in other places. So I think that's the cause of the main cause of the deterioration in the Midwest. I think it's more of an open question and more policy related why tech is not coming to the Midwest as much as it is in other places. Like you see more, for example, tech hubs in the South than in the Midwest. Definitely in the West and in the Northeast, like New York and Boston and DC. But you have like in North Carolina, there are tech hubs. There is Atlanta, Nashville, in Northwest Arkansas. So there are more kind of tech hubs in the South than in the Midwest, and that is I don't have a great answer to why that is, but that's certainly the two areas where two sectors that are kind of pushing the U.S. economy forward are tech and consulting. Those are the fastest growing sectors especially for high paying jobs, and you don't the Midwest is underrepresented in those industries.
I agree with you. I think the idea of the manufacturing, you said almost rightly, I think, that the Midwest states are victims there. It's just bad luck.
Yeah.
But the reality is that was a concentrated choice by Washington policymakers because they viewed the world as America needs to transition away from low-cost manufacturing because we're not going to be able to compete with other countries. So we created international trade policies that motivated owners of manufacturers to shift manufacturing away from the Midwest. And then, I feel like you kind of, at least from my opinion, and I read your paper, it seems like you hit the nail on the head. Whereas the South, like Texas, the governor of Texas made a key point of trying to make Texas a tech hub, and they started calling it Silicon Hills. The governor of Utah made a key point of trying to compete, and they label themselves Silicon Slopes. And you have local leaders reacting in different ways to the problems. And so, like, you look at a place like Ohio 20 years ago, the governor would just get on TV and complain about his bad luck. And you have other governors who take the bull by the horns and go in and say, well, hey, we're dealt a bad hand, but we still have strong people. We still have great infrastructure. We still have a lot of resources. Let's take this 20 or 30-year opportunity to reinvent ourselves. And so in some ways you're playing whack-a-mole because the federal government is saying, screw you, screw your jobs. They're going overseas. Good luck. And the local leadership is saying, in one instance, give us handouts so our people can eat. And in the other instance, you have the governor saying, give us handouts so we can build a new industry. And cities and states that have done that tend to be the ones that have been doing better, at least from my perspective.
I do agree that the federal government, and I would say like most of the elites in the country, they could have done more to compensate the victims of the decline in manufacturing. It wasn't. They didn't do much, both parties, and I think a lot of the anger in the Midwest is because of that. Because how much to allow competition, how much to support areas that suffer from declining in manufacturing. That's a political decision. You could do more or you could do less, and for the most part, the U.S. Government, the federal government, didn't do much. So I think part of that is a choice, and Midwesterners are angry about that choice.
Well, that's probably also explains why we have such an emphasis now and political rhetoric on tariffs, on reshoring, bringing jobs back. And Matt mentioned it earlier, but we were referring to NAFTA, right? That was a bipartisan law signed by President Clinton, and both sides supported that. But there was no the transition.
NAFTA too. I mean,
well, other and government policies, but there was no the transition from that era into the new era. And you mentioned Texas and other areas prepared well, but the Midwest just got caught upended.
Yeah, like in the, I think a lot of the shift to the Republicans in the Midwest happened partly as a result of the Obama administration that didn't focus on a lot of the suffering in the Midwest happened during the Obama years, and helping them was not a top priority. Through the last days of the Obama administration, he tried to orchestrate another trade deal, the transatlantic one.
Yeah.
It didn't succeed, but that was, I think, kind of the attitude of one of the reasons that the Democrats have lost the blue collar and the working class, I think, is in those years the neglect of the areas that lost manufacturing.
There's an interesting stat, Gad and Matt. Of the 100 electoral votes that flipped Republican between 2012 and 2016, 50 were in Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa. Sorry, 20 were 20 more in Pennsylvania. So you see how the winds have shifted, the political winds.
Yeah.
Do you think this is? Do you think the Midwest states are? Never mind. I think the answer is obvious. The Midwest states are over absorbing the decisions of globalization to the extent that other states are under absorbing, and I feel like that is the point: is that these Midwestern states are taking the brunt of policy decisions that other states are benefiting from. And so what it really is the bifurcation of who benefits from a globalization uniparty versus who would benefit from restrictionists. But the problem I see with the broad argument is there are states that have done really well that are in that area, like North Dakota. That wasn't on your chart, but I think North Dakota's per capita GDP has been exploding over the last few decades. I think South Dakota as well. So it's not, you can't paint it all with a big brush, I guess what I'm getting at.
Yeah. Well, I think North Dakota in particular, that's a lot of it is fracking and oil and gas. That is a big driver there. So yeah, there are kind of mini stories within the big stories.
Yeah.
Gad, your background, you've spent years, starting with the conference board, with labor, and certainly jobs are, in the news, and we're still creating them, and it's still positive, but people are still threatened by, or feel threatened by AI, the shifts, the automations. We're talking about these policies. This is well, most of us are old enough to remember, certainly in the 80s and the 90s when the auto manufacturers started to shut down, and then all the their suppliers also were affected. But there were healthcare shortages, and at that time we're going to retrain all the production workers to become nurses, which famously failed badly. It was tough taking a not a mechanic but a line worker and putting him in patient care. Now it worked to some degree, but as a whole there was a lot of other issues. We're sort of back to that with a lot of automation, also with looking at minimum wage increases or living wages, a trend toward doing that, which feeds into the inflation cycle, and then companies cut back. So what do you see on the labor front with jobs, how that's going to impact inflation? You already said there's a little shift in that with productivity, but there's a lot going on in that area, and also how immigration is, what's the outlook for that?
Right. So I think one of the most interesting thing in the labor market is that despite relatively strong growth in jobs, at least until June, in July we had a big kind of a relatively weak number, but through June we had a solid job growth in the US. And despite that, the unemployment rate rose pretty significantly from 3.4. I think the latest number is 4.3, so a pretty sizable increase. And I think that the reason for that, the main reason, is the massive immigration, especially the border crossing in the south border, and the significant rise in apprehensions. So until recent months, the number of apprehensions at the south border were gigantic, and many of them, with a bit of a delay, entered the labor market. So a lot of the apprehensions, especially the ones that are related to asylum seekers, they can join the labor market legally after they get a permit after several months, and many of them enter the labor market illegally. And that created a huge boost to labor supply in the last 2 years, especially in occupations that where the cross-border border crossers can work in, more on the kind of manual services and blue collar. So that's one of the main reasons for the increase in the unemployment rate. Now we may see slower job growth moving forward, but we are also likely to see. We know that apprehensions in the last 4 or 5 months declined significantly, partly because of government policy changes. There are fewer apprehensions, and so I think the boost to the labor supply from apprehensions will come down at the same time that perhaps job growth is coming down as well. So it's not obvious that we'll continue to see an increase in the unemployment rate. We may seen most of it. I think, but the two factors of how slow job growth will become versus how fast immigration will continue to grow, those are the critical factors there.
There's been some interesting stories, good and bad, about the crossings at the border. I know it's controversial, and it raises the hackles of people on both sides. But there's some towns, even in the Midwest, which were decimated by deindustrialization, where a lot of these immigrants were settled. And a lot of Ukrainians who had a lot of technological skills too, apparently, were settled in some of these towns. They couldn't find any workers, and revitalized whole downtown areas. So immigration has to be looked at sensibly. We need a good immigration policy. We don't need a chaotic border for sure. But what you brought up there was interesting. The rise in the unemployment level. It does seem to correlate.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't want to kind of opine on how I feel about immigration in general. There are obviously different opinions, but I think in terms of labor supply, if there are more immigrants, there is more labor supply. So from that, this is just almost by definition, yeah.
And of course, it should be said we have a hugely declining fertility rate in America. If we didn't have immigrants over the past 20 years, this country would have a real serious problem.
Yeah, from labor supply, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, looking and again going into the crystal ball and there's so many things that are coming up determining who gets in the White House, who controls the Senate, who controls the House. There's so many things, but in general, but just in maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks, we're anticipating the rate hike from the Fed. What's your outlook, Gad? Where do you see some hiccups, some roadblocks, some challenges, and then also Matt? I mean, what are you hearing from in your circles, from executives and your investors? So Gad, I'll throw it back to you first. And then...
Sure. So I think I would say the answer in like a very, very high level for the US. I think growth-wise, the US is doing very, very well. Especially if you compare it to other advanced economies. That's I think also important. Like we don't operate in a vacuum. I think the way to judge the US is based on how they're doing compared to other similar economies. And in that test, the US, from a growth perspective, is doing fantastically well. And I do think that I think it will continue to do relatively well because the US is the tech hub of the world. And tech is the main determinant of future economic growth. But where the US is having more problems is in the distribution issues, both income distribution and also distribution across locations. I think a lot of the hurt is located in certain areas, and the Midwest is part of that. So even though if you just look at like GDP growth, you see why there is nothing to complain about. But when it comes to issues like trust in governments, trust in democracy, and things like that, the US is actually not doing well because there is a feeling that the system doesn't work equally well for everyone. And I think that's the biggest risk and the biggest thing that we should focus about in the US.
Yeah, I mean, I think this graphic just highlights that within half the states of how it's not distributed equally.
Yeah.
I have an interesting take. Can you put that graph back up there, Ira? Or Gad? So this isn't growth of GDP per se. This is share of information, professional, scientific, and technical services in state GDP. And there's a little part of my spidey sense looking at that, and I'm like, wow, those are the states that are going to get hurt if AI actually comes to fruition. And I was talking to I got a new refrigerator yesterday because mine broke, and I was talking to the delivery guys, and they're asking, what do you do for a living? I'm like, what do you do? And then they're like, what do you guys think about AI? And I was like, well, I think your jobs are safe. I'm not sure about me. And I think that might have some truth to it because you look at Tyler Perry is a famous movie producer, and I don't know if this is true, but I read the headlines in the New York Post, which I think is a good newspaper, started by Alexander Hamilton, said that he was planning on building an almost $1 billion movie studio until he started playing around with Chat GPT movie production capacities. And he's like, oh crap, I'm not going to build a studio. I need server space. I need server time. I need this and that and the other. And I just kind of look at that list. And I'm like, things tend to have a way of whipping back and forth. And I just wonder if you're overexposed to tech. I'm on Twitter a lot. I'm on a lot of the Reddit forums, and the tech forums are full of programmers who are unable to get jobs because it used to be that they were getting $300,000 a year plus a stock options package, and now they're being offered $150,000 a year to supervise AI doing what they used to do, to spot check programming in AI. And Mark Andreessen said we're a year or two away from AI spot checking AI, and you don't need the engineers doing it. So I look at that chart and I wonder if maybe we're looking at it the wrong way.
So I think it's even within tech, there are winners and losers. I think the owners of the tech companies and the top executives and like the top professionals, they are going to benefit from it. But kind of the more of the rank and file programmers and other kind of white collar occupations, they are going to suffer from it because I think their jobs are going to be exposed to AI. But
that's going to be a real challenge for those states.
Yeah, that I think that is true. But the owners of those companies and the top executives, they will benefit greatly. And like if you look at the stock prices since ChatGPT, if you look at the stock prices of the tech companies in the US, they've done very well. And so the owners of those stocks that are to some degree, everyone who has a 401k is an owner, but they are much more concentrated in among like a few people that are located in Silicon Valley and New York and Boston and Seattle, and they'll definitely benefit more. So I would say, yeah, even within tech, there are winners and losers.
I mean, if I were a tech worker, I'd be scared by two things. One, Elon Musk firing what was apparently, I don't know what those people did, but it's said that he fired between 80 and 90% of his firm over a course of
in Twitter, you mean?
Yeah. Twitter, yeah. Sorry, no, not the successful ones. He never hired them at the successful ones. I mean, the graph this weekend, my God, of the number of people and the amount of federal dollars spent on Boeing's spacecraft that's now basically a doorstop and you got two hostages up there because they don't want the humiliation of Elon going and picking them up. It's something like 10,000 workers and $6 billion at Boeing for basically a dead, useless spacecraft. And Elon, with half the amount of money and about a third of the amount of workers, has done something like 100 launches. I mean, it's unbelievable if you have efficiency as part of your mindset, what you can accomplish. And I would be worried if I was a tech worker. I mean, I'm worried as a financial services worker. Ira's got the right thing going because what you've got to do is you've got to transition yourself to entertainment and get yourself an audience.
Right.
Because once AI takes over your job, what are you going to do?
Audience is good. I'm also curious,
so
Gad.
So Matt, I won't show you the AI that I just delivered or that I just created of me.
You're Bora Bora right now. You're not even here.
Yeah, right. You're a real person, though, Ira.
No, yeah.
You're a real person. I wanted to quickly ask Gad, have you looked at the policies of both parties? I know there's a lot of overlap between both. Each seems to copy the other on different things, from not taxing tips and so on. But let's say on energy policies, the Democrats seem to be net zero policies versus the Republicans are more drill, baby, drill. And we're led to believe that will cause a gusher of prosperity. Whichever party gets in, will we see significant economic differences, or will it be all net? They'll just play by whatever the markets dictate?
Well, first of all, it's important to remember that the president of the United States has very limited power when it comes to domestic policy. Uh, you have Congress, you have the Fed, you have like a lot of the spending is done at the state and local level. So, so that's I think one of the good things about the U.S. that when it comes to domestic policies, one person can't do too much damage. I hope. So I think the impact will be limited, but they're definitely on some issues like trade and immigration and energy. There will be could be big differences between the two parties.
We're coming up toward the end, so I always like to kind of do the wrap up by asking each of you, if there's something that you wanted to ask, or if there's a comment that you wanted to share that you didn't have a chance to do this. So let me start with John on this.
Yeah, well, I was going to just talk about the US savings rate and massive debt and the $35 trillion deficit and so on. I saw an interesting stat. In 1920, the savings rate in America, of personal disposable income, I think it was like 3%, was what the rate then. And I think today it's something similar. But in 1945, just after the Second World War, it was in the region of 21%. And of course, the Second World War was a time of great hardship, sacrifice. People were saving. There was the war effort, and it was a frugal period. And then America underwent a massive period of prosperity after the Second World War, right into the 50s. And car production, just boomed. So no period is comparable. I don't compare the 1920s to what we're doing now or the 1930s, but it's always interesting that if we are a little more careful and prudent and save and so on, the US government and households, you can dig yourself out of a lot of holes.
Can I comment?
Yep.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I would say I'm less worried about personal debt because people, if they don't save enough, they are the ones who are going to pay for it later on. But I am more worried about public debt because there the connection is not that clear. And there used to be, like, at least my profession, economists were they were kind of the people who were most calling for a balanced budget and to be careful about public debt. And that kind of evaporated a little in recent decades. I would say even recent decade, like now economists are not that worried about or became less worried about public debt. I don't know if for good reasons. I mean, it was partly because they thought that low interest rates would last forever, which is not doesn't seem to be the case. So I think there is no one now, in general, everyone is becoming more populist. There is no one who really cares about public debt anymore. I think the Republicans pretended to care, but they didn't really care. So nobody cares about that. And when nobody cares about something, whenever there is a crisis, the solution would to have more debt. And so that's something I am worried about.
I mean, I completely agree with you. You had Donald Trump, who's supposedly running as a Republican, announcing that he was going to not tax tips. And, me and my friends, we started looking around being like, well, how do we work for tips in the future? And we came up with a number of ways. I mean, it's not that hard to imagine a doctor going, putting out a tip jar and being like, hey, it's going to be $10 for your thing, but you better leave a nice tip, else you're not going to be invited back, and then you leave $500 tip.
Well, that's already been automated on every,
no, it'll go back. It'll go right back to cash. But the problem is that's coming from the Republican, and then you had the Democrat copy it. And then the next day, the Republican announces he's going to pick a vice president. He goes out and I guess just decides that everyone should get $5,000 in cash for every kid they have, which I agree with John. We have a birth rate problem, and one way to fix that is to motivate people to have kids. But handing out $5,000 in cash doesn't sound like a Republican type policy. And then you have the Democrats match it. So what you have right now, and no one's talking about the deficit, and the deficit is insane. And that's not to mention the debt. Now, I agree 100%. Well, I guess I don't know if I agree on the personal debt stuff with Gad, but I do think national debt, whether you call it a jubilee one day, whether you call it whatever you want to call it, at least for the United States of America, to me, it's not a problem, because one day they'll just print the money, and they're doing it slowly. I mean, they've been doing it slowly since the 1970s, but going back to, I think, 2014, when the debt was around $17 trillion, and it's doubled in basically 10 years, and it looks like it's going to triple in the next 20 or 30 years. And there's nothing that seems to stop it, because no one's talking about reducing Social Security. No one's talking about reducing Medicare. Only one party is talking about raising Social Security taxes. Only one party is talking about raising taxes at all in general. So you have two parties that are there fully focused on taxing and spending. Or not taxing and spending, not taxing and just spending. But I guess my bigger point, I'm sorry I went on that rant, is, what I think the trend you see is it matters who you send to your city council. It matters who you have as a mayor. It matters who you have as a governor. And in this era of federal government being dominant, and it sounds like earmarks are coming back, it matters who you send to Congress. And you need someone that can go there and fight for your particular district and your particular state. And I don't know the particulars of Midwest, but when earmarks went away, when I was growing up, the most powerful congressman in the world was Dick Gephardt, and he was a congressman from Missouri. And I remember when we would drive across country, and I was 16, and you'd get the Missouri border from Kansas, and all of a sudden the infrastructure was fantastic. The bridges got better and the roads got better. I asked my dad, I'm like, why is Missouri so much richer? And he's like, well, they have a better congressman. And you're like, oh, so that's how it works. So I think it comes down to, you've got to vote not on these national issues. You got to vote on local issues, and vote for your own self, and vote for your own state, and do that, and not get distracted by, the wokeism fights or all these other stuff that just is there to distract you. Because that's the uniparty trying to make you angry at your neighbor, rather than the party that's supposed to be representing you fighting for you. That's my opinion.
Tip O'Neill once said, all politics is local.
Not anymore.
Yep. No, but we need to go back to that, I guess.
Agreed.
Oh, you're muted, Ira.
Now, Gad, I'll let you wrap up the show. So.
With one thought, or
however you want to do it.
Well, I so again, to me, the thing that I worry most about is democracy, and I see in other countries, including the one that I come from, which was. There is a deterioration in democracy, and this will eventually cause a deterioration in the quality of life. And I know that in the US, it seems far-fetched at the moment, but I think if you read history, you shouldn't be too relaxed about democracy staying forever. So to me, that's like the number one thing to be concerned about.
Wow.
Well, we will be continuing that conversation, I know, at least for the next few months and beyond. So, Gad, maybe hopefully we can get you back on. Maybe after the election's over, and get your take on where things are going. But, who knows? Again, living in the never normal, we'd be on for 55 minutes. So in the world outside this show, wonder what's happened. But I want again to thank you, Gad, for joining us again. Appreciate it. I've mentioned your newsletter. How can people get a hold of that? How can they also reach out to you? What's the best?
Just find me on LinkedIn. That's where I operate. Yeah, and the Burning Glass Institute website.
Yeah, okay, which I've had running and scrolling here, and you also have a number of good, really good white papers up there, especially for those interested in the labor markets, education, and then definitely subscribe to Gad's newsletter. John and Matt, any concluding words?
No, but I asked Gad and Matt before we went on the air, any forecast so I could make some money on gambling and who's going to win the election. Everybody said it was a toss up.
Yeah.
Flip the coin.
Yeah.
Well, until next month, appreciate everybody being here at the corner of Main Street and Wall Street. We look forward to having you again. Watch for the announcement when our September show will be. I know it's going to be a little tight. I'm traveling a little bit and juggling everybody's schedules, but we will be back again, and hopefully looking to have one of the pollsters come in and either in September or October, and hopefully give us a take on what they think is going to happen. Everyone, please be safe and continue to don't let the shift hit your plans.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching Geeks, Geezers, and Googleization. Be sure to listen to the podcast and follow us on YouTube.